Even while staying invisible, I gain control over their entire world. Welcome to my new story.
For 5 years, I stood behind the same counter, under the same flickering lights, wearing the same name badge no one ever bothered to read. Customers handed me their deposits. Managers handed me silence. I learned early that being reliable made you invisible. So I stopped expecting recognition and focused on endurance. Then Mark arrived, new branch director, polished shoes, loud confidence. He spoke about efficiency and fresh blood like the rest of us were stains on the carpet. Within weeks, my hours were cut, given to his nephew, a boy who couldn't balance a drawer without supervision. When I raised concerns, Mark smiled thinly and told me to be grateful I still had a job. The building began to rot under his watch. Emergency lights failed, fire exits were blocked by storage crates. The HVAC system was rerouted to save costs, filling the back offices with a chemical stench that made people dizzy. Complaints disappeared, emails went unanswered, safety reports were marked resolved without inspections. I kept working, quietly, watching. What no one knew was that the building wasn't owned by the bank. It never had been. Years earlier, after an inheritance and a careful investment, the deed was transferred into a holding company. One I controlled. The lease was airtight, and buried deep inside it was an emergency provision for life safety violations. I waited for the last Friday of the month, payroll day. The lobby was packed. That's when my attorney arrived, then the fire marshal, then a locksmith. The order was read aloud: gross negligence, immediate closure. Mark laughed at first, until the police asked him to step aside. His access card was confiscated. The doors were locked. Customers were escorted out, confused and angry. The branch went dark before noon. By Monday, corporate was calling, apologizing, negotiating. They paid triple to reopen. Mark was terminated for cause. His nephew vanished with him. I never returned to the counter. The building still stands, clean, safe, profitable. I pass it sometimes, unnoticed, just another face in the crowd. And I smile, because the people you overlook are often the ones holding everything together. And sometimes, they're the ones who can shut it all down. For 7 years, I worked the late shift at the Municipal Services Office, tucked into the ground floor of a concrete building most people barely noticed. I processed permits, filed complaints, smiled when spoken to, learned how to exist without being seen. When Darren became my manager, that invisibility turned useful to him. He talked about budgets like they were weapons, said the department was bloated, said some of us weren't pulling our weight. My hours were cut first, no warning, no explanation. The extra shifts went to his college friend, hired as a consultant, who didn't know the difference between a form and a folder. Then the safety issues started. Emergency stairwells were locked to prevent loitering. Smoke detectors chirped for weeks without replacement. The electrical room flooded during a storm, and Darren ordered maintenance to ignore it until the next quarter. I documented everything: dates, photos, emails. He deleted my reports and told me to stop being dramatic, so I stopped talking. What Darren never asked was why I never complained to HR, why I never threatened to quit, why I kept showing up even after my paycheck shrank to something barely livable. Years earlier, after my mother passed, I invested her life insurance carefully. One opportunity stood out: a distressed property sale, a government lease attached, the building. I didn't put my name on the deed. I didn't need to. A trust did that for me. And the lease Darren never read included a compliance clause tied to labor and safety regulations. I waited until inspection week, when auditors were scheduled but not expected. That morning, my lawyer arrived with a city inspector and a court order. The violations were undeniable: the stairwells, the wiring, the flooded electrical room. The building was condemned for temporary closure. Darren argued, raised his voice, demanded someone take responsibility. Then the inspector asked who authorized the safety overrides. His name was on every form. By sunset, the office was shut down. Employees were sent home. Darren was escorted out, still holding his phone like it could save him. The city called me the next day, apologetic. careful, willing to renegotiate everything. I didn't return to my desk. The building reopened months later, fully repaired, fully compliant, under a new manager. Some people think power looks loud. Sometimes it looks like patience. For almost a decade, I worked in the archives of a regional insurance firm, 3 floors below the executives and 2 decades behind the technology. My job was to keep records alive, contracts, amendments, old mistakes everyone hoped would stay buried. I did it well, too well. When you're useful and quiet, people stop noticing you exist. That suited them. New leadership came and brought a different kind of neglect. Budgets tightened, staff vanished, safety checks were postponed. The ceiling above the file room leaked every time it rained. Water pooled near electrical cabinets. I reported it, once, twice. Then I learned silence was easier than being labeled difficult. Years passed that way. Raises skipped, promotions promised and forgotten. I watched managers come and go, all of them assuming the building belonged to the company, that the walls were as permanent as their authority. They were wrong. I never corrected them. The building had a history. Decades earlier, during a corporate downsizing, it was quietly sold to a private trust to keep it off the balance sheet. When my father passed, that trust passed to me. Along with every clause in the lease they never bothered to read. One clause mattered most, a termination provision tied to safety compliance. Clear language, no loopholes. If conditions became hazardous and were ignored after notice, the landlord could revoke occupancy immediately. I documented everything, the leaks, the mold, the faulty alarms. I sent notices through proper channels, received automated replies, and waited. The day the power flickered during a storm and the backup generator failed, I made the call. Inspectors arrived before noon, so did my attorney. The violations stacked quickly: electrical hazards, water damage, blocked exits. The order was signed by mid-afternoon: evacuate, close, secure. Executives flooded the hallway, confused, angry, demanding explanations from people who had no answers. When they asked who owned the building, the silence felt heavier than the years I'd swallowed mine. They tried to negotiate, threatened lawsuits, offered promotions I no longer wanted. None of it mattered. The clause was absolute. Within weeks, the company relocated at enormous cost. Several managers were dismissed. The archives were digitized. My position was deemed no longer necessary. I didn't argue. I left with my box of things and a calm I'd earned slowly. Some power announces itself. Some waits. For almost a decade, I worked in the archives of a regional insurance firm, 3 floors below the executives and 2 decades behind the technology. My job was to keep records alive, contracts, amendments, old mistakes everyone hoped would stay buried. I did it well, too well. When you're useful and quiet, people stop noticing you exist. That suited them. New leadership came and brought a different kind of neglect. Budgets tightened, staff vanished, safety checks were postponed. The ceiling above the file room leaked every time it rained. Water pooled near electrical cabinets. I reported it, once, twice. Then I learned silence was easier than being labeled difficult. Years passed that way. Raises skipped, promotions promised and forgotten. I watched managers come and go, all of them assuming the building belonged to the company, that the walls were as permanent as their authority. They were wrong. I never corrected them. The building had a history. Decades earlier, during a corporate downsizing, it was quietly sold to a private trust to keep it off the balance sheet. When my father passed, that trust passed to me. Along with every clause in the lease they never bothered to read. One clause mattered most, a termination provision tied to safety compliance. Clear language, no loopholes. If conditions became hazardous and were ignored after notice, the landlord could revoke occupancy immediately. I documented everything: the leaks, the mold, the faulty alarms. I sent notices through proper channels, received automated replies, and waited. The day the power flickered during a storm and the backup generator failed, I made the call. Inspectors arrived before noon. So did my attorney. The violations stacked quickly: electrical hazards, water damage, blocked exits. The order was signed by mid-afternoon: evacuate, close, secure. Executives flooded the hallway, confused, angry, demanding explanations from people who had no answers. When they asked who owned the building, the silence felt heavier than the years I'd swallowed mine. They tried to negotiate, threatened lawsuits, offered promotions I no longer wanted. None of it mattered. The clause was absolute. Within weeks, the company relocated at enormous cost. Several managers were dismissed. The archives were digitized. My position was deemed no longer necessary. I didn't argue. I left with my box of things and a calm I'd earned slowly. Some power announces itself. Some waits. For years, I was the night administrator at a private medical office, the one who locked the doors, balanced the logs, and made sure the building didn't fall apart after everyone important went home. I worked quietly, reliably. When mistakes didn't happen, no one noticed who prevented them. The partners called that replaceable. When budgets tightened, my hours were reduced without discussion. When I pointed out broken emergency lighting in the east stairwell, they told me it wasn't my concern. When a storage room filled with mold from a slow pipe leak, they covered it with shelves and kept seeing patients. Liability, they said, was a future problem. I learned my place quickly. Show up, say nothing, collect less pay. What they never asked was why I never fought back, why I never threatened to quit, why I listened more than I spoke. The building had been mine long before they arrived, purchased quietly through an investment group after a malpractice settlement forced the previous owners to sell. My name wasn't on the sign. It didn't need to be. The lease was long-term and detailed, and inside it was a provision tied to health and safety violations. Clear, enforceable, immediate. I kept records, dates, photos, emails ignored and requests denied. I sent formal notices the way the lease required. They dismissed them as routine paperwork. The inspection happened on a Wednesday, unannounced. The health department, fire safety, structural compliance. It didn't take long. Mold, faulty exits, improper storage of medical waste. By noon, the order was issued. Close immediately. The partners argued, raised their voices, tried to blame staff. Then the officers arrived to ensure compliance. Patients were escorted out. Equipment was locked inside. The front doors were sealed while the waiting room still smelled like disinfectant and panic. One partner finally asked who authorized this. I handed over the documents: ownership records, lease clauses, court notices. The room went quiet. They were walked out of the building they thought they controlled, past the same doors they'd ignored for years. No speeches, no apologies. Just consequences. The clinic never reopened there. The lawsuits followed them. Licenses were reviewed. Reputations cracked. I left that night for the last time. Keys in my pocket, job officially eliminated. They were right about one thing. I was replaceable. They weren't. I worked at the logistics hub on the edge of the city, a low concrete building where trucks came and went and people like me blended into the background. My title was Junior Facilities Coordinator. It meant keys, clipboards, and being blamed when something went wrong. No one learned my last name. Most didn't learn my first. Management called me small, temporary, easy to replace. When costs rose, my overtime disappeared. When I flagged safety issues, they laughed. A cracked support beam in the loading bay. Fire extinguishers passed inspection. A fuel leak near the generator. Not your problem, they said. Stick to your lane. So I did. I showed up. I took notes. I kept copies. What they never noticed was how carefully I read documents. Years earlier, when the company expanded too fast, they sold the building to stay liquid. A quiet deal, a shell corporation. Later, through a chain of inheritances and a single risky purchase, that corporation became mine. I never announced it. Power didn't need an introduction. the contract mattered more. Buried in the lease was a clause triggered by structural neglect and safety violations. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. If hazards were reported and ignored, the landlord could suspend operations immediately. I reported everything. By the book. In writing. Received polite acknowledgments and no action. I waited. The shutdown came on a Monday, peak shipping season. Inspectors arrived with my attorney before sunrise. The beam failed inspection. The generator was condemned. The fuel leak sealed the decision. Operations halted by noon. Supervisors shouted into phones. Executives demanded names. Someone finally asked who owned the property. I handed over the file. Contracts, deeds, notices. Silence followed. The order was enforced. Trucks were turned away. Workers were sent home. Security escorted management out while the dock sat empty and exposed. They tried to stop it, threatened legal action, offered promotions, offered money. None of it mattered. The clause was absolute. The shutdown stood. Within weeks, the company relocated at enormous cost. Several leaders were dismissed. Investigations followed. The building was repaired properly, slowly, correctly. My position was eliminated during restructuring. I didn't contest it. I walked away with everything settled and nothing left to prove. They thought being small meant being powerless. They were wrong. Sometimes the smallest signature on a contract is the one that brings everything to a stop. Okay. For 8 years, I worked behind the frosted glass of a regional bank, processing forms no one wanted to touch. Account closures, compliance notices. The quiet work that kept everything legal and invisible. Customers barely looked up. Managers barely remembered my name. Being overlooked became routine. When leadership changed, it got worse. New executives walked the floor with rehearsed smiles and sharp shoes, talking about modernization while cutting corners. My desk was moved closer to the records room. My hours were trimmed. My role was described as non-essential. I listened. I nodded. I stayed. The building told a different story. The emergency generator failed monthly tests. Fire doors stuck when humidity rose. An old vault vent leaked carbon monoxide into the basement offices. I filed reports. They were marked resolved without inspections. One manager joked that I worried too much for someone so replaceable, so I stopped reminding them. What no one ever asked was how I afforded my quiet life, why I never pushed back, why I didn't panic when my schedule changed. The bank didn't own the building. Years earlier, during a merger, it had been sold to an investment trust to improve the balance sheet. When my aunt passed, that trust passed to me, along with every clause in the lease. One clause mattered, a contingency tied to life safety violations. Ignored hazards, written notice, immediate remedy, or immediate closure. I followed the process exactly. Notices sent, deadlines missed, silence returned. The keys stayed in my pocket. The shutdown came midweek, just before payroll. Inspectors arrived with a court order. Fire safety, environmental health, structural compliance. The failures stacked quickly. The generator, the doors, the vent. By afternoon, the order was signed. Close, evacuate, secure. Executives flooded the lobby, demanding explanations from staff who had none. When someone finally asked who authorized this, I stepped forward and handed over the documents. Ownership, lease, notices. The room went quiet. They tried to negotiate, apologized, promised promotions and protections. It was too late. The clause didn't allow bargaining. The bank relocated months later at enormous cost. Several executives were dismissed. Investigations followed. I didn't return to my desk. I walk past the building sometimes. Clean, silent, still mine. They overlooked me for years. They never noticed I was holding the keys the whole time.